The text-to-vector beta is out today in Adobe Illustrator. I'm going to show you how I incorporate it into my illustration workflow. Over here we have text-to-vector in the properties panel. I like to select the patterns option and I'll set my color mode to black and white so I'm just looking at the texture, not the colors. I'll try a few different prompts, grain and dots, ink and watercolor. Every time I create a texture and click on the variations, it adds those to my pattern swatches library. And it does a really great job making them seamless textures. I love adding textures to my work, but it's such a tedious task. Not to mention the uncertainty if a texture I create will work. This lets me see a lot of options quickly. I'll use generative recolor to change the colors in my original illustration. I'm trying to capture a vintage 70s kitchen aesthetic, a little autumnal, a little spooky, a totally different vibe for me. I do like to go back and edit my illustration further with the classic recolor panel once I've picked my favorite color palette from the generative recolor options, where I can then make adjustments to the colors, the brightness, and the saturation. At this point, I'm just working through my process, deciding where and how to add texture. You can add these as overall texture fills to the entire illustration or to individual objects. You could also add these to your shadows and highlights if you wanted to get really specific about how you apply them. These are vector textures, so I can also go into pattern editing mode, where I can use generative recolor again to recolor my patterns as well to fit with the mood I'm trying to capture. I'll reuse my initial prompt, which was vintage, autumn, mushroom, kitchen, to keep everything consistent. I can also scale them up and down again without any issue because they're vector. I really like this process because it still feels like my work and I'm in control of how much or how little I add to my illustration. Here's the second pattern. I'm going through and recoloring this one as well. I really explored scaling this texture up and down. These textures are seamless, so scaling doesn't cause any tiling. Everything looks consistent across my smaller elements, as well as my larger ones. Experimenting with changing the blending modes, opacity, and even applying textures to the shadows. Finally, I decided to add the texture to the background as well. I tried a bunch of different options and then I picked the one that I added to the caps on the mushrooms. And you can see here it kind of just helps bring everything consistently together. It kind of reminds me of like a 70s wallpaper, which I think works with the aesthetic I'm going for. In the end, I chose not to add overall patterns to the shapes, but focused on just the midtones, leaving the highlights and shadows as color overlays. Alright, let's do a little side-by-side comparison of my original versus the altered versions. I also altered the facial expression in the end and the sparkles to match the mood of the new design.